Welcome everyone. I'm Natalie Hepner, a student in the Emerging Media Department. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, I welcome you all to Teach-In Tuesday. With Teach-In Tuesday presentations, the College of Arts and Sciences fosters discussion and reflection on social and cultural problems that we face locally and globally. Today's event will begin with a pre-recorded presentation from Computer and Information Science Professor Dr. Amelia McNamara about how data-driven algorithms impact our lives. This talk will explain basic algorithm terms and provide tools to push back against them when they reinforce biases in society. After the presentation, Dr. Manjeet Rege, Chair of the Graduate Programs in Software, will facilitate further discussion about the topic.
Hi, I'm Dr. Amelia McNamara, and today I'd like to talk to you about algorithmic accountability. First, a little bit about me. I have my PhD in statistics, and I teach in the Department of Computer and Information Sciences. I'm really interested in the ways in which data gets used to impact the world around us. People are sometimes surprised when they come into my statistics class that we end up talking about things like race and class because they think of statistics as neutral. But because data is about humans, it encodes all our biases and proclivities. Because of that, I like to start with a little privilege alert. I'm a white, straight, cisgender, upper middle class, highly educated, I have a PhD, American lady. Other than my gender, I have almost every axis of privilege imaginable. So I'm doing the best I can when I talk about these sensitive topics, but you should always feel free to call me out, publicly or privately, if you hear me saying something that's offensive or inappropriate. So today I want to talk to you about algorithms. And an algorithm is a set of instructions to achieve a specific goal. Right here, I'm showing you a sorting algorithm that's arranging the pixels on the screen in order of color. And this algorithm is called merge sort. There are other algorithms, like bubble sort, that would use a different set of instructions to achieve the same goal. So we could see that right here. And sorting algorithms tend to be pretty neutral. The algorithms I'm more interested in are the ones that are based on data. I think about data as any information that we can collect. So we could write it down on a piece of paper or record it on the computer about the world. So numbers are data, that's probably the easiest thing to think of, but pictures, text, and user behavior can be data as well. A lot of times, the data that's collected is data exhaust, data that streams off of us as we go about our daily lives, without us being consciously aware of it. So as an example, on the more intentional side, I wear a smartwatch that tracks how many steps I take. I chose to wear this device, so I'm collecting the data intentionally, but I'm certainly not thinking about recording the information every time I take a step. And there's a lot more data exhaust that streams off me every day. When I swipe my credit card, the credit card company records what store I was at, how much I spent, and often what items I bought. When I browse online, cookies follow me around the web, recording my behavior. And when I use my cell phone, GPS location of where I am is often captured. This kind of data gets used in data-driven algorithms all the time. For example, consider credit card fraud monitoring. Using data, the company has made a set of instructions to determine if a particular transaction is legitimate or fraud. If I do something out of the ordinary, my card might be frozen, or I might get one of those verification phone calls. A lot of people have smart thermostats in their homes, which record data to generate an algorithm and adjust the temperature up and down automatically according to their behavior. And if you ask a map program like Google Maps to navigate you somewhere, it uses an algorithm to determine the fastest route available. Almost all these algorithms take into account real-time traffic information, so you're given the quickest route, not always the shortest in terms of miles. And the data for this traffic information comes from data exhaust. When you began using your GPS app, you probably agreed to allow the company to access your GPS information. The way that Google knows there's a lot of traffic on the 101 in Los Angeles is that they know there are a lot of cell phones in that location, and they're not moving very fast. So these algorithms do something that humans might have been able to do, like detect fraud, but do it more quickly and in an automated way, or they do something that would be impossible for humans, like continuously determine the traffic patterns on major streets around the world. So far, these algorithm examples probably seemed pretty benign, although if they started malfunctioning on you, they could really impact your life. For example, if your credit card transactions were always incorrectly being flagged as fraud, it would take a lot of time out of your day to verify your transactions, or it might even make it hard for you to make purchases at all. And because algorithms can have impacts on people's lives, we want to ensure that they are fair. The idea of algorithmic fairness is pretty complicated. So I'm going to start by telling you about the statistical ideas of bias and variance. Now, when I say bias here, I'm not referring to the most common definition of bias, which has to do with human prejudice. Instead, I'm talking about the statistical definition of bias. So this diagram with the bullseyes gets used a lot to illustrate the bias-variance trade-off. The best case scenario is low bias and low variance. You're a consistent shot, and you're always getting right in the middle of the bullseye. That's pretty good. You could instead have low bias but high variance, which is that you're getting the bullseye on average, but your shots are more spread out. Then in the bottom left, we have low variance but high bias. The shots are consistent, close together, but they're really far off from the center of the target. And then there's the worst case scenario, high variance, high bias. The shots are all over the place, and they're systematically off from the bullseye. If you've taken Stat 320, which is applied regression analysis, you've probably seen a lot of pictures like this. I'm showing you a graph of some points, which look like they have a negative trend. And if we wanted to model this data, we could use a straight line. Then to make a prediction, our algorithm would be to go out to the point we are interested in on the x-axis, go straight up to the model line, and make a prediction. And then if we consider this highlighted point, our guess is a little bit off. We over-predicted, but it's not too terrible. And if we think about all the points in the cloud, sometimes we're over-predicting, sometimes we're under-predicting, but we're not biased overall. But what if we used this algorithm? Again, we're going to go out on the x-axis up to the model line and make a prediction. Now, if we think about this highlighted point, we're way off. And if we think of all the points overall, we're off for all of them. We're over-predicting for everyone, and that is a biased estimator. Algorithms can help us do things more quickly and in a more automated way, which makes them really appealing for things that happen in high volume. But they can also be biased. So if the algorithm has statistical bias that's worse for one group than another, it starts to approach the more common definition of bias, like personal prejudice. So for example, Amazon started using an algorithm to assess whether job applicants should be interviewed or not. They fed the computer data on previous successful job candidates and asked it to generate an algorithm to decide which candidates should be interviewed. That algorithm is a lot more complicated than the line model I showed you, but it also followed a set of rules to come up with an answer of whether a person should get interviewed or not. The problem is, most of the successful job applicants in the past were male, either because of human bias in the interviewers or simply the number of men who apply for those kinds of jobs. So the algorithm decided to penalize resumes that contain the word women's, as in women's chess club or women's rugby. And this led to a bias in the decisions the algorithm made, a bias that was specifically against women. And Amazon has since stopped using this algorithm. As an example closer to home, consider exam proctoring software. These algorithms use methods like facial recognition and eye tracking to try to determine if someone is cheating. The problem is they see any deviation from normal as suspicious behavior. These algorithms might be biased towards saying people are cheating overall, but they're especially biased against certain groups. That eye tracking software might falsely flag you if you are blind, if you have a disability like ADHD that makes you fidget, or you have caregiving responsibilities that mean you have to look at kids in the room. Basically, anyone outside the majority could be incorrectly flagged. But this algorithm is still actively in use. So these algorithms are impacting people's lives in real ways. If the algorithm decides you shouldn't get an interview, you may not be able to get a job. If the algorithm decides you're cheating, you could be kicked out of your university. An even more extreme algorithm is the recidivism risk scoring algorithms that are in use in the justice system. These algorithms can be used to decide if people are let out on bail or held in jail while awaiting trial, whether they get imprisoned or are let off on parole. And those are huge, life-changing decisions. The thought process behind making these algorithms was good. Human judges are often biased in the human prejudice sense. They have conscious or unconscious bias that might impact how they sentence people. So the idea was a machine could be more neutral. But again, this algorithm is based on data, and the data comes from our judicial system, which has historically been biased against people of color in terms of more policing, more arrests, more convictions for minor crimes. If you feed that data into an algorithm, it's going to reinforce that bias into the future. So in this example, we have two people who were arrested for the same crime of petty theft. But even though the white man had a history of armed robbery, the algorithm assigned him a low-risk score, while the black woman, who had just a history of juvenile misdemeanors, was assigned a high-risk score. Beyond that, the journalists who broke the story were able to see what these people did in the years after their arrest. The white man subsequently committed grand theft, while the black woman did not reoffend. And so overall, the predictions failed differently for white and black defendants. White people were more likely to be labeled low risk, yet reoffend, what statisticians might call a false negative, while black people were more likely to be labeled a higher risk, but not reoffend. We'd call that a false positive. So this algorithm is biased in a statistical sense. There are many other places algorithms are used. In social media, self-driving cars, online advertising, child protective services, loan offices, and more. And algorithms can have huge impacts on people's lives when they make incorrect predictions. Because many of them are based on data, they can make decisions that reinforce past biases of society. So the question is, what can we do about this? The first thing is to keep in mind who data science and algorithms serve. Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein have a great book called Data Feminism, which is about these exact issues. Even though it has feminism in the title, it's not just about gender issues. They talk about intersectional feminism, which includes elements of race, class, disability status, and much more. They say that data science often serves the three S's: science, which is universities, surveillance, which is governments, and selling, so that's corporations. So that's our first step. Keep our eyes open to the ways in which data and algorithms are being used to perpetuate inequity. And when you see these things, push back against them. For example, student groups at other universities have been successful in getting their school to stop using surveillance software. Technology moves so quickly that the law often struggles to keep up, but it also seems like we should have some regulations governing the use of algorithms, including transparency, so humans can understand how the algorithms are making their decisions, and fairness, which is more complicated than I've made it seem so far. So you could also ask your representatives to introduce some laws. Another thing I suggest is to do what Mr. Rogers says and look for the helpers. So there are people doing really good stuff with data and algorithms and fighting back against the bad ones. Some people that I really respect in this space are Dr. LaTanya Sweeney, the founder of the Data Privacy Lab and former Chief Technology Officer at the Federal Trade Commission. Or Dr. Jake Porway, the founder of DataKind, which helps connect people who have data problems with people with data skills, all with the goal of social good. Or Tawana Petty. She's an activist and a poet who's pushed back against the use of surveillance technology. She's also one of the founders of Data for Black Lives, an organization founded to use data science to improve the lives of Black people. Dr. Joy Balamwani is a computer scientist and digital activist who has shown many examples of computer vision not recognizing Black or brown faces. She founded the Algorithmic Justice League, a group fighting back against algorithms that are biased. If you have money, another thing you can do is support independent journalism by subscribing to newspapers or making donations. The stories that I showed you today and many more have been broken by journalists. If you're a student, another thing to do is to learn more about data, algorithms, and models. There's lots of good stuff out there to read. So if you want to learn more about how algorithms get used in our society, I recommend Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil, or Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks, or Artificial Unintelligence by Meredith Broussard. If you want a more humanist perspective on data, check out Living in Data by Jer Thorpe. If you want to get more technical, Modern Data Science with R by Ben Baumer, Danny Kaplan, and Nick Horton is great, and it's available for free online. You could also read the Data Practices Manifesto from the Linux Foundation. Or my very favorite recommendation, Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignacio and Lauren Klein. Again, there's a free online version, and I think it's just an amazing book. If you prefer watching to reading, check out Coded Bias on Netflix. It features Joy Balamwani, who I mentioned earlier. Or if you want to get into the nitty-gritty details of bias remediation, check out this talk by Erin Liddell. There's also lots of classes at St. Thomas that would talk about things like this. I'm personally involved in the data analytics and statistics programs, but I think justice and society studies and women, gender, and sexuality studies probably have thoughts on these topics. There's also relevant graduate degrees in the graduate programs in software, the School of Law, and the College of Arts and Sciences. And of course, you can also ask me questions after this talk or find me on campus someday. And with that, thank you so much for your attention.
And now for a live discussion led by Professor Manjeet Rege.
Hi, as Natalie said, my name is Manjeet Rege. I'm the chair of the graduate programs in software here at University of St. Thomas. And as we begin the discussion here, I'm joined by Dr. Amelia McNamara. We invite you to send us questions. We'll try to wrap up our discussion by 1 p.m. And we'll try to get through your questions as much as possible. We have a in-house AI algorithm that will be sorting through the difficult and the easier questions, and we'll try and take perhaps the difficult ones first. Fantastic talk, by the way, Amelia.
Thank you.
I liked how you began describing what an algorithm is, and the fact that there are certain algorithms that work on the data, like a sorting algorithm. And then there are certain algorithms that learn from the data, and that is what leads to a model, right? So often when we hear the term algorithm, the same algorithm may perhaps lead to a perfectly unbiased model, whereas if fed with some data that has inherent bias with it, it can lead to a biased eventual model, right? So what's your take on it based on your background in statistics?
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. That it's not necessarily the algorithm that's biased, it's the data that's being fed in. I think, one of the algorithms, which I didn't specifically talk about, but is a slightly more complicated version of that model that I had with the straight line, is logistic regression, which does kind of binary classification. It's kind of yes, no, are you going to recommit a crime or are you not? That kind of thing. So it can predict if there's two possibilities. And logistic regression gets used all the time. I think statisticians would call it an unbiased estimator. But if you feed it data that has bias in it, then it's going to create a biased model.
Speaking of bias, what are the different strategies for reducing the bias? Like, for example, we have seen that facial recognition algorithms work better for lighter-skinned subjects compared to darker-skinned. And that's primarily because of during the model training phase, there weren't enough training examples of those type that are eventually being misclassified. So, when from an AI perspective, we often talk about data validation, that is, looking at different slices of data. Do we have a proper representation? And perhaps we might not notice that in the beginning, but when you train the model and you try it out on, let's say, holdout or a test data, and you notice that there are certain errors happening, that's when you get an insight that perhaps we can go back and have more example of certain types, so that bias that our model has learned can be reduced as well. Are there other strategies from your point of view?
Yeah, so I think you're completely right that one of the reasons that facial recognition and some of these other algorithms that have trouble on people of different races have those problems is because of the training data sets. And I love that you were talking about like a representative sample, because that's such a statistical idea to think about, is this a representative sample of whatever the population is that we're interested in? It kind of makes me think of, there's a paper by Leo Bryman about the two cultures, and there's algorithmic modeling, the algorithmic modeling culture, which is kind of more of a computer science perspective, and then there's the data modeling culture, which is more of the statistical perspective. And I think that statisticians are often really concerned about, do we have a representative sample? And I think that is something, if you're going to try and generalize and have your algorithm work on all Americans, then you need to make sure that the photographs you're training it on are representative of all Americans. So that's one piece of it. But I think the other piece of it is that there are people who are in the minority, people who are racial minorities. Maybe even if you had a representative sample of the entire United States, you might have a smaller proportion of those people in your sample because they are less represented in the population. And because that's a smaller part of the data set, then it's harder for the algorithm to learn what to do with those particular cases. So I think one strategy that people use is up or down sampling, where they take the data set and they're like, okay, this is a bunch of white faces and just a few black faces. Let's try and add more photographs of black faces into the data set so that it's more balanced. Even though the population maybe has a smaller proportion of people of color, you want your training data set to be more balanced to help the algorithm learn.
Right. So you're trying to do data augmentation, either going out there and collecting data, which might be challenging, or there are frameworks like TensorFlow, for example, has a data augmentation class where, depending on the images that you're training on, you can tweak those images. That an example that I use in my class is, if I'm doing, let's say, a cat versus a dog classifier, and most of the cats are, let's say, upright in the pictures, you can do image augmentation where on the fly the images are getting tweaked a little bit. So there might be cats that are, let's say, sideways, upside down. So even though you did not have initial data about it, you're learning different orientations on the fly as well. So that is also a way of reducing bias.
Yeah. So you're kind of using an algorithm to help another algorithm or another piece of the algorithm learn better.
Right.
Interesting.
A question that we have is about algorithms for grading in an academic setting, or checking cheating, for example. How could bias come into the picture in that particular scenario?
That's a great question. I mean, so there are some automated grading systems that will sort of look at an answer and decide if it is right or not. I think, at St. Thomas, the automated grading that I use the most is in Canvas, and I'll have a quiz, and the answer is, 46.2, and I put into the box, like, the answer is 46.2 plus or minus a little bit. And so I'm giving that algorithm the rule, like, as long as the answer is right in that space, then it'll be counted as correct. But then I think there are much more complicated grading algorithms where you say, like, here are some essays, and these are good essays, these are A essays, these are B essays, these are C essays, and now, here's a new essay, what grade should we apply to that? And I know, like, I think that ACT, SAT, those kinds of standardized tests are still doing human grading, but I've heard that they're starting to do some algorithmic grading as well. And I think that that's the kind of thing that they would be doing, feeding in past examples of good essays, quote unquote good essays, and then having the algorithm make some guesses. So I think part of the way that bias can come in is if the grades that were given to those previous essays were given some type of biased grade. Like maybe the instructors who were grading them, they liked certain students better, and then the algorithm is going to pick up on whatever the kind of turns of phrase that get used by those types of students. It's going to say like, oh, well, this is something that might flag a good essay. And so I think that kind of relates to the example from Amazon where they had those resumes, and then the word women's was getting flagged as someone who shouldn't be interviewed. It's not that someone wrote that into the algorithm, like when you see the word women's, like throw out the resume. It was just a word that was kind of associated with resumes that didn't go further. So I think any time where there's some variability in the training data, then you can end up sort of reinforcing whatever is getting flagged by the humans in the algorithmic decisions.
Right. I know that you serve on the UTAC committee, University Technology Advisory Committee. A question from our audience is, does St. Thomas use any algorithms that you're aware of, and have they had to change any of the algorithms in the past?
Oh, that's a great question. So we definitely have talked a little bit about algorithms on UTAC. I know the General Counsel has come in and talked to us because they're working on a policy, I think that has to do more with data than with algorithms. Like how is data collected about people at the University of St. Thomas? How is it stored? When is it discarded? And things like that. In terms of algorithms that I know are in use, I think that some instructors are using Proctorio, which I mentioned in the talk, as an algorithm that can detect cheating. We could talk about that as well, but I think sometimes Proctorio is actually a low-paid human being watching someone and saying that they're cheating or not. So it's not actually an algorithm. It's sort of like magic that makes it seem like a computer is making the decision. But anyway, so I think Proctorio is in use. The other thing that I think is a potential area to explore is the use of biometric data. So we talked a little bit about facial recognition. There's other biometrics. There's eye scans, retinal scans, fingerprints. St. Thomas is using palm scans as the way to identify students as they go into the dining halls, and so the algorithm is taking that data and deciding is that who is it, and is it someone who has an account, and so there's a potential for bias there, I think. And then just beyond that, I'm a little bit concerned about the use of biometrics as identification measures in general, because it's not something, if your palm scan gets stolen, it's not like your password that you can change or your credit card that you can cancel. That's attached to your body forever.
Right. Speaking of bias, algorithms learn from data, and if there is a stereotype that exists in the data, that is going to trickle down into your eventual model. I remember there was a study a couple of years ago that they had a web scraper that went out and basically collected all of the web data, text data on the web, and based on that, learned the different stereotypes that existed. So, for example, if you ask that model what man is to a woman, a king is to a what, it would apply queen. But if you asked what man is to a computer programmer, a woman is to a what, and it replied a homemaker. So that was based on the stereotypes that existed in the data that existed on the web. I know that recently the Biden administration had a press release talking about reducing certain biases that exist in terms of limiting opportunities for young Americans. Because as educators, we know that we want our students to see role models who are like them, look like them, and if you have a search being performed by a particular, let's say, population demographic, and if they're not able to see a role model, that greatly impacts their progress in life, right? So, what's your take on this particular press release? Is this something that is easily achievable?
I think no, it's not easily achievable, but I think it's a great goal. And so you were mentioning, this sort of text scraping and then learning stereotypes. I don't know if I know the exact paper that you're talking about, but I know that there's lots of areas where that has been shown to be true, like search suggestions in Google give different suggestions for sort of stereotypically black-sounding names versus white-sounding names, and ads that get served can be different. And I think that does, if you're getting different search results and different ads, that can impact the way that you think about yourself or the opportunities that you have. So I know Facebook for a while was allowing some advertisers to target their ads based on race, and that could limit the opportunities that people have based on what ads they see. So yeah, Biden, it was part of the State of the Union, I think. One of the goals that they said was they wanted to stop discriminatory algorithmic decision making. And I think that's a great goal. Like you're saying, it's not easy. That's going to be a really hard thing to do. You have to decide, what is fair, and there's no just correct answer. Like everyone has different definitions, and if it needs to get codified into law, that's going to be tough. I think it's going to require some audits of algorithms, and that's going to take a bunch of technical skills. And yeah, then there's going to have to be some enforcement in some way. I know the Federal Trade Commission has recently they forced, I think it was Weight Watchers Corporation had to destroy a bunch of data that they had collected about minors, and then an algorithm that they had developed, like a model they developed based on that data. And the FTC was like, "This, you shouldn't be collecting data about kids. You shouldn't be building this algorithm, and now you have to destroy it." But that's, I think, only the third time that they've done something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. The goal is something that, if achieved at least partially, it will lead to equality of search experience. It shouldn't be that if I go and search for something, I end up seeing certain results catered to my skin color, for example. And in that same, I think, goal, they've also talked about avoiding or reducing targeted advertising for, let's say, children as well.
Yeah.
So, one question that we have received here is, every service that we make use of, either through an app or online, has behind the scenes an algorithm being used, right?
Yeah.
So, how can we become more conscious of when and where algorithms are being used as a everyday individual? I know it's a tough question because every consumer-facing product has an underlying ML and AI. I mean, Google has so many services. Every consumer-facing product, touching product, has an AI behind the scenes. But as an end user, can you really be aware that this is AI behind the scenes, or can you not?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, again, I have a couple thoughts. So one is, sometimes, I think I mentioned this before, sometimes when it looks like an algorithm is doing something or computer vision is doing something, it's actually secretly low-paid humans doing that thing. So I know Expensify, which is an online system where you like take a photo of your receipt and then it submits it to your company's expense reporting system. They came under fire because it turned out they weren't using computer vision to scan those receipts. They were just paying people on the internet, I think through maybe like Amazon Mechanical Turk, to type in the data and do the data entry. And that meant that they were sharing personal financial information with just kind of random people online. Same thing with Proctorio. Sometimes when an algorithm like that is determining if someone's cheating, there's actually just a low-paid human watching them behind the scenes. So I think sometimes it's hard to tell if it's really the computer or if it just kind of looks like it's the computer. But I think even if you don't have technical skills to think like, how was this algorithm developed, you can think about the general idea, like how could I imagine that a computer could make this decision? So, when I say words out loud to my Amazon Echo, for example, not that I have an Echo, but then it has to record my words. Somehow the computer has to take the sounds that I'm making and turn it into probably text, and then it needs to search that against some database. And so just like trying to think about when I use a piece of technology, how could it possibly be functioning? I think that will help you be more aware of the use of algorithms all over.
Right. In your talk, you spoke about the unfairness of algorithms in the law, for example, and how it relates to people reoffending. Right? One question that we have pertaining to that is, what changes do you hope to see in algorithms used for law enforcement and the justice system? And in the past, have you come across instances where algorithms have been adjusted to reduce the bias?
Yeah, I think that's an important question as well. So, with the recidivism risk scoring algorithms, the one that was in that ProPublica piece was by North Point, and I think it's called COMPAS, C-O-M-P-A-S. I forget what the acronym stands for. But that was a product that was being sold as a black box to, judges or to judicial systems. And so it just said, get people to fill out this survey. It's like about their, how they grew up and a few other demographic factors. Put that information in, and then a score will come out on the other end. So I think that one thing that folks who are in this space are calling for is more transparency in algorithms. So having that algorithm say, like, people who answered that, when they were growing up, they heard gunshots outside their house. If you said yes to that, your prediction is going to go up by this much. And then that would allow humans to inspect that and be like, do we really, even if that somehow seems predictive, do we really think that that is the thing that's going to maybe cause someone to reoffend or not? So I think having more transparency about how algorithms are working is one piece of it. I know, after the story was publicized by ProPublica, several of the states and counties that were using that algorithm have stopped using it. So I think, stopping using it is a good thing. But on the other hand, like I said in my talk, the idea behind it was good, right? Humans are biased. We don't want to be making biased decisions about who goes to prison, right? And so how can we make an unbiased decision? And so I think that if you could improve an algorithm so that it was making a decision that we think of as fair, that might be better than having a human make the call. But it's just such a complicated, what is fairness? So after ProPublica published that story, North Point came back and said, actually, you did all your statistics wrong. They had this 39-page report where they point by point were like, no, you're talking about false positive and false negative, and really it's about sensitivity and specificity, and it's sort of like all these conditional probabilities. You have to really kind of understand stats to be able to read this report. And I've seen some, more understandable explanations of that basically say, it's not that ProPublica was right or North Point was right. They're both right, but they're making the case from different directions. And so if we're going to say that an algorithm is fair, again, we have to decide what that means. And it's not a simple thing. So another thing that they had in their rebuttal is they said that ProPublica didn't take into account the different base rates of recidivism for blacks and whites. And ProPublica countered that they did actually take that into account, but to me, and I'm not a judicial system expert, the idea that there is a different base rate of recidivism for different races of people, that seems like something that we should be challenging and saying, is that actually true that some people are more likely to recommit a crime? Or is it that there's over-policing in certain neighborhoods and people are more likely to get picked up for crimes, and we actually want to tell the algorithm, we think that everyone kind of has the same rate of recommitting a crime. That's my opinion. Of course, this would have to be decided by society, but it seems like If we're living in a democracy, we don't want, one company giving us a black box and saying, just trust us, put your data in, and an answer will come out, and it'll be fine.
Yeah. You mentioned about Dr. Joy Polomvini, and I have admired her work as well. She has a paper along, I believe it is with Dr. Timnit Gebru, who was formerly at Google.
Yeah.
And they did a study on gender identification model. So basically, you just present a face image, and the model just has to identify whether it's a male or a female. If you just toss a coin, you'll be correct half the times. Now, if the picture presented was of a white, let's say blonde person, the error was extremely low. But if it was, let's say, an African American female, then the error was as high as, I think, 46% or 48%. So almost close to a random chance. And there are many other examples like these as well. Apple, I believe, a couple of years ago was in the news where if spouses applied for a credit card, the husband would get a higher credit limit, but the wife would get a lower limit on the credit card. So closely related to that, the question that we have received is, have there been any consequences to these large companies of using these bias models, for example?
So I think there haven't been very many consequences. So I mentioned that the FTC recently told Weight Watchers that they needed to destroy some data they'd collected about kids, as well as the model that they'd built based on that data. I think they had made that call three times now. And the middle one, I can't remember. The first one was the Cambridge Analytica model, where a bunch of Facebook data was shared with Cambridge Analytica and may have impacted our presidential election in the United States. So those are sort of the three examples that I can think in the United States of companies having a consequence. I think outside the United States, there's maybe a little bit more of it. So in the EU, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, gives people some rights about their data and how it gets used. And so I could imagine that there's been more lawsuits and things like that that have come up against companies in the EU, although I'm not super familiar with them. But yeah, I remember that case with the Apple credit cards. It was like they had all joint accounts, so all of the credit data was exactly the same. They were like the same age. The only thing that they had given differently was the gender. And then because you mentioned sort of like gender classification algorithms, I think the folks that I follow online basically say, like, you shouldn't be doing that. Like, A, gender isn't binary. B, you can't tell someone's gender from their face. And C, like, I try and say this to my stat classes as well, is like, why would you want to know someone's gender from their photo? Is it because you want to give them more targeted advertisement and you think that women are more into this and men are more into that? I mean, we're just sort of benefiting capitalism, and that's not always my MO, I guess.
Right. Now, based on the data that an AI has access to, it is possible to predict different aspects about a person. A study that we did along with my students was based on how you tweet, you can predict what age group you belong to.
Sure.
So, when we tweet, we're not using perfect English, we're using a lot of abbreviations.
Yeah.
So based on your age group, you're comfortable using certain abbreviations more. So, with our limited resources, we were able to predict with a relatively high accuracy what age group we belong to as well. So a question that we have is it possible to use algorithms to predict human behavior? So that's part of the question. And the other is it ethically correct to do that?
Yeah. I mean, And again, with going back to the question of like, have companies had any consequences for how they've used algorithms? And the GDPR in particular, I think has forced a lot of companies to give people access to the data about themselves because it's required by the European Union. So like, I don't know if you've tried to do this, but you can get all of the data that Facebook has about you, which is the posts that you've made, the photos you've uploaded, but anything you've liked, any ad you've clicked on, all the messages that you've sent and things like that. And you can also see the categories that they've inferred about you. So I deleted my Facebook account a couple years ago as sort of a protest about Facebook's use of data. But I remember looking at the inferred categories about me, like what age I was, what race I was, what my interests were. And they were pretty accurate, not 100% accurate, but pretty good. And some of that Facebook has some ground truth data. Like I think you have to put your birthday in on Facebook. So it knows exactly how old I am, but it can also then try and infer from data and then make a prediction and see how good it is. And then the question of like, is it ethical to try and make guesses about people's demographic characteristics or their behavior? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think to some extent the targeted algorithms that are giving you the TikTok posts that you want to see or the ads that you're like, oh yeah, I do want to buy that product. Like maybe that is improving people's lives to some degree, but maybe it would be more ethical if we just said no targeted advertisements. Everyone sees the same ads. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Right. With AI, there has been a lot of noise about deep fakes as well.
Oh, sure.
And there has been a lot of work. There have been some research groups that have developed AI models that actually detect or classify whether a particular video or image is a deep fake or is it authentic or not. Similarly, along those lines, are you aware of work where an algorithm may detect if there is a bias in another algorithm?
Yeah, I don't know of algorithms that detect bias in algorithms. I think that that's a great idea and a way to kind of like push back against algorithms. In terms of the like deep fakes and classification there, I've definitely seen that work. I've also seen ways like artifacts that aren't visible to the human eye that can be added to a video to make it seem real or to get the algorithm to classify it differently. So we're talking about like classifying images as cats or dogs. There's ways to sort of game the algorithm by putting things in to what looks like a photograph of a dog, but little artifacts so that the algorithm classifies it as a cat. And I've even seen people doing some of that in the real world. So I can't remember the name of the artist who has sort of makeup that you can put on that will thwart facial recognition technology. So you can make your face look asymmetrical, and then a camera that's out on the street wouldn't be able to detect that you were a human. So people are kind of like, it's like adversarial responses to algorithms. I'm certainly aware of that.
If someone is a consumer of a model output, basically, and you have no control over the training data that went in, what are some of the best ways to test that a bias exists in that model? I remember that when some of the initial smart speakers were deployed, they were trained on certain population demographics. So when they were deployed to a wider population, based on the differences in how people speak, also for children, it wasn't working out well. So that came back as a feedback to the company, and then they went back and retrained the model and fixed that error. But as a consumer, how would you overcome that issue? How would you even detect that there is a bias here?
I mean, I think I've seen lots of people doing their kind of own ad hoc experiments, right? So like I looked up a plane ticket and it said that it was this cost. Like, you know, ask your friend who lives in a different state or has different demographic characteristics to you to search for that same ticket to see if it has the same price. Or, you know, have two people, you know, speak to some voice recognition software and see how it turns out. I think in terms of being able to make a case that an algorithm is biased, you need a lot of data. You need a big sample size. And so again, I think that's one of the places where journalists have been really powerful because they've been able to either use Freedom of Information Act requests to get data about you know, people and whether they've recommitted crimes, or they've crowdsourced information. So I know ProPublica also had a story about ad targeting on Facebook, and what they did is they asked all their readers, will you send us these pieces of information from your Facebook data output, and then we can sort of pull that data set together and have a larger sample size to make a case about the way that Facebook is targeting advertisements. So again, I think, you know, that's something that we could maybe do as researchers or journalists could do. It's pretty hard for one individual to do it, but I think you can kind of play around with little experiments to give yourself an idea.
Overall, are you optimistic about using AI in our daily lives? Do you have smart devices? Do you use social media? Are you adding to the data exhaust?
So, I mean, I think that I try to keep a balance. So I don't have any smart devices in my own home. I find that a little bit creepy to try and bring more surveillance into my house, and, you know, the way that Ring doorbell cameras have been, you know, that data has been sort of bought or accessed by the police seems sketchy to me. I do use social media a little bit. So I deleted my Facebook account a few years ago over concerns about their use of data, but I am a super regular Twitter user. So I'm definitely not, you know, trying to stay away from computers altogether. And I think that I'm sort of guarded in terms of my feelings about algorithms and AI. I think that there's great potential for good, and I think, you know, the idea of making something unbiased, I think that it's possible. I don't think that we're there right now, and I have a lot of negative feelings about the way that things get used at the moment. But I think that if there's more awareness in society and we start talking to our lawmakers and talking to the technology companies and getting things more transparent, that we could have a really positive future.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, Dr. McNamara, and thank you everybody in the audience for asking us questions as well.
Great.
We hope you found this Teach-In Tuesday informative. We'll see you on April 26th for a Teach-In Tuesday presentation from Dr. Patricia Maddox on the importance of LGBTQ+ youth coming into their identities in supportive environments. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, thank you for joining us.